against his parents' generation. His father, who worked for the Ethiopian state tobacco firm, belonged to a party pushing for Eritrea to be fully merged with Ethiopia. His uncle Solomon Abria, a stalwart nationalist, was governor of the northern Ethiopian province of Wallo. He would later be one of the 60 officials executed when a military junta seized power in Ethiopia in the 1980s. Isaias's mother was of Tigrayan descent, which he found embarrassing. Immigrants from Tigray, a poor Ethiopian region just south of Eritrea, tended to hold the lowliest jobs in Asmara: street sweepers, maids and sex workers. Isaias's family was solidly middle class, yet his grandmother, to whom he was close, made money distilling and selling maize, mead, a far from respectable occupation in the eyes of conservative Highland society. Childhood acquaintances remember that when Isaias and his friends were walking back from school, he would slip away and surreptitiously enter the family home by the back gate. Those who visited the EPLF's mountain hideaway were astonished to discover a sophisticated network of trenches, pharmaceutical laboratories, schools, guest rooms and even a hospital, much of it dug under the barren rock. Outside his childhood world, a bigger drama was unfolding. Ethiopia was then ruled by an emperor, Haile Selassie, who was supposed to respect Eritrean autonomy under the terms of the Unfederation Agreement. Instead, he slowly turned the smaller country into a vassal state, banning political parties and forcing schools to switch from Tigrinya, the language most Eritreans spoke, to Amharic, the language of Imperial Ethiopia. In 1962, when Isaias was 16, Ethiopia formally annexed Eritrea, a land grab that gave Haile Selassie long-desired access to the sea. Eritreans felt betrayed. The world had stood by as its people were turned into second-class citizens in a desperately poor African state. Isaias went to university in Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital, to study engineering. Here he encountered snobbery towards Eritreans, which was particularly pronounced among members of Ethiopia's Amhara ruling class. The experience left him with a lifelong suspicion of the university-educated. It also fed his appetite for political activism. The campus was turbulent, with left-wing students outraged by Ethiopia's feudal conditions, calling for change. If you showed signs of independent thought, you could be singled out for a self-criticism session in which you would be personally attacked. Isaias caught the revolutionary bug. After a year, he abandoned his studies and headed to Sudan to join the Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF, an independence movement which was staging hit-and-run raids on the Ethiopian army and police. It was a route many Eritrean youngsters were taking, but when they joined they found the organization was being pulled apart by differences between Muslim lowlanders and Christian highlanders. Frustrated, Isaias and two comrades talked about forming a secret splinter group. They got matching tattoos of the letter E, for Eritrea. A few years later, Isaias would have one of them executed, the other is assumed to be dead or rotting in one of his jails. In 1967, a few ELF fighters were chosen to go to China and receive military and political training from Mao's revolutionaries. Among them was Isaias. At Nanjing Military College, recalls Mesfin Hagos, a fellow guerrilla, lectures ranged from the theoretical, how to mobilize the people, how to form a vanguard party to lead the struggle, how to create a people's army, to the intensely practical. Recruits learned, among other things, how to manufacture explosives using exclusively local materials, how to lay a landmine, how to blow up a bridge. There was time for some revolutionary tourism, too. Carefully monitored by their hosts, the Eritrean recruits were taken to see Mao's birthplace, the site of his historic swim across the Yangtze River, and the Great Wall of China. All of those who went to China were very marked by it, says Mesfin. We were very young, so it left a deep impression. It was not just how our Chinese tutors handled us, it was the expectations they had of us, what they thought we would go on to do. The experience left Isaias with a lifelong affinity for China, a taste for mutai, a local hooch, and a useful playbook for eliminating opponents. he is said to be an obsessive reader of books by and about Mao. I have a picture of him taken in an underground bunker, and behind him you can see a bookcase full of Chinese volumes and books published by Progress Press in Moscow, says Dan Kamal. But it was Mao's military writings that had the greatest impact. When he returned to Africa, Isaias found the elf consumed by internal disputes. He later complained that the organization was so focused on factions, clans and religion that its cadres would never talk about Eritrea. His ministers would gather to meet Isaias after a trip abroad, but he would simply sweep past them, forcing them to quiz reporters to find out how it had gone. Isaias and like-minded comrades slipped away, setting up a group which eventually merged with other breakaway units to become the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, ELF. It was a Marxist movement that 6 of his siblings would eventually join. A bitter civil war would rage between ELF and EPLF until the former was pushed into Sudan. The ELF emerged triumphant as the primary movement resisting Ethiopia. The ELF's first Secretary-General was Ramadan Muhammad Nur, another Chinese-trained fighter, but Isaias was widely recognized as its real commander. He was smart, hardworking, decisive in everything, and we needed that at the front, recalls Mesfin. The struggle, as it was known, would last another 2 decades. By 1978 the various liberation fronts controlled 95% of Eritrean territory. But then Mengistu Haile Mariam, an army officer who had toppled Haile Selassie and made himself dictator of Ethiopia, shucked off the country's ties to the United States and instead turned to the Soviet Union. Moscow poured heavy weaponry into the Horn of Africa and the ELF was forced to stage a strategic withdrawal, another concept Mao would have recognized, pulling back to a remote base in the Rora Mountains, where its members regrouped. Isaias felt humiliated, says Paulos Tesfagiorgis. The TPLF were making jokes about him and he could not tolerate that. At its height, tens of thousands of people were involved in what was a shadow state in waiting hidden amongst the euphorbia cactus and wild olive saplings. Those who visited the ELF's mountain hideaway were astonished to discover a sophisticated network of trenches, pharmaceutical laboratories, schools, guest rooms and even a hospital, much of it dug under the barren rock to escape constant bombardment by Ethiopian jets. Fighters emerged and went about their duties at night, sleeping during the dangerous daylight hours. In theory this was a collective of like-minded comrades, dedicated to winning independence from Ethiopia and installing democracy. In reality, Isaias used textbook Maoist tactics to divide his opponents, establishing a secret vanguard party which made all key decisions, and encouraging self-criticism sessions as a way of suppressing dissent. The ELF was run like a police state, recalls Hebert Burhe, a former Eritrean ambassador who started out as one of the group's female fighters. She found the transition from working as a clandestine activist in Asmara to a combatant in the field a shock. If you showed signs of independent thought, you could be singled out for a self-criticism session in which you would be personally attacked in front of trainees. After that no one wanted to be seen with you. According to Hebert, Isaias was particularly suspicious of educated people in the movement, who might pose a challenge to his authority. They were labeled petit bourgeois. Some ELF members pushed back. In the 1970s he came after them, unleashing 2 purges in which people whose loyalty he doubted were denounced and punished. Musi Tesfamical, one of the original trio to tattoo an E on their shoulders, died in the clandestine executions that ensued. In the 1980s Isaias launched the 3 Privileges campaign, in which mid-ranking cadres were encouraged to heap shame on their superiors for drinking, womanizing and exploiting their positions. There were no trials, just public shaming, but that was the worst, recalls Mesfin Hagos. If you are humiliated in front of your own troops, how can you ever be a commander? And some of those attacked were his close friends. There was an irony to these denunciations, as Isaias himself has a reputation as an aggressive drunk who often makes use of his fists. For all the fear that he instilled, Isaias was also admired. Comrades remember a man who never sat still, either occupied with some practical task, cooking, building a shelter, repairing a trench wall, or studying. Perhaps making up for his interrupted education, he would return from trips carrying piles of books he'd urge the fighters to read, setting up study groups to discuss socialist theory, the roots of Zionism, or international affairs. Paulos Tesfagiorgis, who ran the Eritrean Relief Association, the ELF's humanitarian wing, noticed the same dogged determination when it came to mastering the languages Isaias needed to get his message out. I saw someone who was moving very, very fast. When I first met him, his English was not very good, but when I started bringing journalists to him, I saw him beginning to use complex words to discuss humanitarian issues with non-governmental organizations and government officials. Isaias mastered Arabic with similar rapidity, according to Tesfagiorgis. He decided he needed to know what was being said in the Arab world. The level of serious hard work involved was amazing. He was always working. His capacity for learning, whether the lessons are put to good or bad use, is extraordinary. In the end, it was the collapse of communism in Moscow that fatally weakened the Ethiopian regime. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, scaled back military support for its African client states in the late 1980s. The Eritreans seized the opportunity to capture town after town. Eritreans of both sexes were obliged to abandon their studies and family farms to go and drill in Sawa, a bleak desert training camp. In May 1991, the ELF routed the Ethiopian army and liberated Asmara. Its convoy of trucks, laden with young fighters, rolled down the Palm Line Central Avenue and were met by weeping, euphoric crowds. It was an extraordinary moment. Largely friendless, powered by little more than sheer grit, the ELF had won independence for Eritrea, defeating one of Africa's best-equipped armies. Looking back, many ELF veterans believe that Isaias had been preparing for this moment back when he launched the Three Privileges campaign, which marginalized ELF stalwarts. Remaining commanders who won posts in the post-independence government felt beleaguered and insecure. The Eritreans hadn't been the only ones fighting the Ethiopian government. In the mid-1970s, students and peasants in the Tigray region set up a rebel group of their own called the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. Its leader, a medical school dropout called Mele Zenawi, reached out to the ELF, asking its more experienced fighters for help. The ELF took a small number of Tigrayans for military training and sent a handful of their cadres to teach the TPLF basic guerrilla warfare tactics. It proved a fruitful alliance. For days after Asmara's fall, a rebel coalition dominated by the TPLF captured Addis Ababa, bringing Mengistu's Marxist regime to an end. The armored column that drove into Addis included Soviet-made tanks driven by ELF fighters, who had turned the capture of Ethiopian military hardware into an art form. Mengistu's defeat left Isaias feeling invincible. As he saw it, he was responsible for liberating not just Eritrea, but Ethiopia too. In the early days of liberation, he used to speak about individual TPLF leaders as if they were under his command. He would try to guide them, lead them, he would talk on their behalf, recalls Mesfin Hagos, who was appointed defense minister in Eritrea's new administration. At home, Isaias consolidated his position. The ELF turned into the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, PFDJ, which quickly became Eritrea's sole legal political party. It was a similar story with the economy, which gradually came to be dominated by the Red Sea Trading Corporation, a firm owned by the PFDJ. Isaias was no more collegial as president than he had been as a rebel. Emmanuel Ayasu, an Eritrean journalist, witnessed this several times at Asmara airport. Isaias's ministers would gather to meet him after a trip abroad, but he would simply sweep past them, forcing them to quiz reporters to find out how it had gone. Information is power for him, says Emmanuel, so he gives them very little. For a brief period in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the world bought into Isaias's vision of himself as a progressive leader. He built hospitals, planted millions of trees on Eritrea's denuded slopes, and saw that food aid was effectively distributed to a perennially malnourished population. Bill Clinton hailed him as one of the leaders of a much-hyped but short-lived African Renaissance. But the relationship between the ELF and the TPLF had always been prickly, in spite of their leaders' common language and goals. During the Ethiopian famine of 1985, Isaias's fighters shut down a key road used by starving Tigrayans to import food aid, a tactical decision the Ethiopians never forgot or forgave. In 1998, Ethiopia and Eritrea went to war. The spark was a squabble over a tiny border village called Badme. The underlying cause was mounting economic rivalry and hot-headed leadership on both sides. Initial skirmishes escalated quickly, and Isaias's bluntness didn't help. His response to the deaths of 12 Ethiopian schoolchildren killed by a stray Eritrean bomb was, "This is war." Confident of victory, Isaias failed to consult his generals on the ensuing military campaign, issuing instructions from his office, hundreds of kilometers from the front. Tens of thousands died. When the fighting ended in 2000, a big slice of Eritrean territory lay under Ethiopian control. And Isaias had no one to blame but himself. In a cable from 2008, published on WikiLeaks, the American ambassador was quoted describing Isaias as unhinged. But predictions that he would become irrelevant proved premature. An International Boundary Commission later vindicated many of Eritrea's territorial claims, but the TPLF-dominated coalition in Addis ignored it. The international community, which saw giant Ethiopia, rather than little Eritrea, as the prime regional power, had agreed to act as guarantors but failed to insist on demarcation. The big brother-little brother relationship between the ELF and TPLF had been turned, unnervingly, on its head. The West's apparent readiness to dismiss Isaias as an irritant while flocking to Addis to discuss aid and business opportunities with the clever, charming melees cut deep, say contemporaries, lies at the root of Isaias's implacability towards Tigray today. Isaias felt humiliated, says Paulos Tesfagiorgis. The TPLF were making jokes about him and he could not tolerate that. He felt utterly betrayed by the international community, a sentiment which of course tapped into Eritrea's long history of betrayal. The disastrous outcome of the war prompted long-checked internal criticisms to bubble to the surface. Key ministers formed the Group of 15, which issued an open letter decrying Isaias's failure to implement a proper multi-party constitution or hold elections. Over the hiss of the Gagjia coffee machines in Asmara's cafes, former comrades openly described him as a dictator, and were happy to be quoted in the independent media. For a brief moment, change seemed imminent. Isaias waited. In September 2001, terrorists flew planes into the Twin Towers in New York, and journalists and diplomats around the world were suddenly thinking about little else. Then Isaias made his move.